Oh, hello. The diesel engine, you must know, is meant to be overhauled and used again after the normal wear of high mileage. Isn't that so, Rick?
That's right. The heavy-duty components that make diesels more expensive originally also have plenty of life left after 150,000 miles or so. So overhaul makes good sense dollar-wise.
Exactly. And therefore, Rick and I will now tell you what every Ford and Lincoln Mercury technician should know about overhauling diesel engines. First, you must remember precision. Clearances are closer than on gasoline engines. Most tolerances are less. Then you must remember cleanliness, because close-fitted parts are not forgiving if you leave dirt inside the engine.
Even so, don't be afraid of the diesel. Just be more careful. Most of the operations are similar to gas engine overhaul. It just takes more care, including use of the right tools and following the shop manual procedures and specifications exactly. Tightening and loosening can be critical, so go by the book. Your most important tools are the shop manual and accurate torque wrenches.
Let us begin by telling briefly how we make a decision to overhaul a diesel engine. What is the diagnosis?
Well, you begin with mileage and symptoms. Is the engine losing pep? Does the exhaust smoke look like oil burning? Then, there are some quick checks that can be done on the engine. Check the crankcase pressure to see if blow-by is excessive using the magnehelic gauge. If the pressure is higher than the manual specifies, there's some kind of mechanical problem. If there is, pull the glow plugs and perform a compression test on the engine with this special high-pressure gauge designed for diesels. If the compression builds up quickly and evenly to specs, the cylinder is okay. If the buildup is slow and not to specs, then there is a problem.
Oh, and Rick, you must remember to observe two important precautions when compression testing the diesel. First, shut down the fuel supply so that a cylinder does not fire during compression. Second, do not squirt oil in the cylinder as you do on gasoline engines. Diesel engines burn oil as fuel, and it could ignite during the test. Is there any further diagnosis?
Well, one other test that applies to any kind of engine, and that's a cylinder leak test. Blow air into the problem cylinder at top dead center on the compression stroke and see where it comes out. Out the exhaust, it's probably a bad exhaust valve. Out the air inlet, it's probably a bad intake valve. Out the oil filler or dipstick tube, worn or sticking piston rings. When you have to remove the engine for overhaul, you'll be disconnecting fuel lines. Be sure to protect the fuel system from dirt by capping the fuel lines. If even a few specks get into your newly overhauled diesel, you can have some real comeback trouble. And here's another tip for a light overhaul. Perhaps just to head off and back on, put the number one cylinder on top dead center, compression stroke, before you pull the head. So you'll know where everything is at for buildup. And when you go to put the head back on, remember to have the cam positioned so that both valves are closed. This will prevent the valves from hitting the pistons. Mr. Diesel?
Here are some important points we should review before going on. High mileage diesels can be rebuilt for very long additional service life. Diesel precision manufacturing means you must be extra attentive to correct procedures, clearances, specifications, and cleanliness. For diagnosis, consider the engine's age, the exhaust smoke, the crankcase pressure, and the compression of each cylinder.
And when you remove fuel lines, cover them to keep the system clean.
Before we get into disassembly, let's stop for a brief quiz. As Rick said earlier, one of the most important tools for diesel overhaul is the shop manual for the engine you're working on. If you follow the procedures exactly and keep your work areas very clean, you will avoid damage to an expensive part that you may wish to put back on the engine.
Thank you. Diesels do come apart very much the same as gas engines. There are some important things to watch for, though. In a major overhaul, the belts are normally replaced. However, if the belt is relatively new and in good condition, be sure to put a drive direction mark on the timing belt or belts so they'll go back on the same way. Once you've removed the timing belt, don't turn the camshaft or crankshaft until the cylinder head is removed. If you do, there'll be a collision between the pistons and valves, and the parts can be seriously damaged.
Normally, timing marks are very well scribed and easy to find. However, to assure correct timing at assembly, it's a good idea to check the timing sprockets or gears to ensure they are clearly indexed to the camshaft and crankshaft. If necessary, scribe marks on them.
Usually the injection pump comes off next, after the timing components. Remember to cap each high-pressure line as you disconnect it, and follow the shop manual procedure. After the injection pump is removed, the cylinder head can come off.
And also, Rick, many diesel engines have aluminum cylinder heads which can be warped during disassembly if the correct procedure is not followed. What is the procedure, Rick?
Just be sure to remove the head bolts in the order specified in the shop manual.
On some engines, when you remove the oil pan, you will observe that each piston has an oil cooling jet. These are used to spray engine oil under the piston in a precise pattern to keep them cool. Be very careful to avoid damaging them.
The connecting rod bearing caps and crankshaft main bearing caps must go back on the same way they came off. If they have numbers and direction arrows, okay. If not, etch the numbers and arrows on before removing them. Don't stamp them on. Before removing pistons, check to see if there are ridges at the tops of the cylinders. If there are, you must ream the ridges before you remove the pistons, otherwise they will catch and damage the pistons or rings. I like to cover the connecting rod bolts with short pieces of rubber hose to protect the crankshaft journals from damage whenever I remove and install the pistons. Now some engines require special rod installation guide tools that are used to protect the oil spray tubes during installation. They can be used at disassembly as well to protect the crankshaft journals.
After each piston is removed from the cylinder block, remove the protective hoses and install the bearing cap on its connecting rod. That will keep the rods and caps from getting mixed up. With the pistons and rods removed, carefully lift out the crankshaft to complete the disassembly of the engine. Of course, there will still be the intermediate shaft or camshaft on some engines, which are easy to remove by the shop manual procedure. Remember these points for disassembling the diesel engine. Keep your work area clean. Use the shop manual procedure.
Protect all parts from damage as you remove them. Protect the high-pressure fuel system from dirt by capping the fuel lines.
And mark the timing components and bearing caps for correct assembly. Now it's time for a quiz. We now come to the inspection of the disassembled diesel engine and the measurements that must be made to the basic engine components to see if they are reusable and if any refinishing is needed. Remember, in diesel engines that the cylinder, piston, and crankshaft are more closely fitted, and the measurements must be made with precise care and with accurate instruments. Once again, don't be afraid of the diesel. For the most part, you clean up the components, inspect them just as you would gasoline engine parts, and decide if they're good for another 150,000 miles. Follow the shop manual procedures and specifications to pass or fail each part. Now, to consider some of the critical checks, shall we start with the cylinder block, Rick?
Sure. First, the cylinder block must not be damaged in any way, as you will observe while thoroughly cleaning it. Then, the deck surface, where the head is mounted, must be checked for very precise flatness according to the instructions in the shop manual. If it's not flat within specifications, it must be replaced. The cylinder bores must be measured for the wear limit and for taper or out of round. These limits are very small on diesels, so the bore gauge must be very accurate. When the bores are within the manual specifications, they don't need to be machined, unless there are minor imperfections to be removed by honing. If they are excessively worn or have deep scoring, they can be rebored for oversized pistons.
Oh, and Rick, remember that some diesels have replaceable cylinder liners. Be sure to follow the shop manual procedure for removing, replacing, and checking the liners. When a replacement liner is installed, it has to be checked for tightness in the bore. The installed bore diameter must be checked to be sure it didn't get distorted, and there is a specified limit for how high the liner can extend above the deck.
Like gas engines, diesel cylinder bores should be honed if necessary to leave a light crosshatch pattern for breaking in the piston rings. And after you hone the cylinders, be sure to wash them perfectly clean using an oil-soaked rag for the final cleanup. That'll catch all the metal particles.
On some engines, the piston oil spray jets must now be installed in the cylinder block and very precisely aligned. Also, they must be protected from damage when the engine is rebuilt. The diesel engine must use engine oil that's recommended for diesels because the lubrication requirements are much more severe. Use only oil that is recommended by the manufacturer. Refer to the owner manual or operating guide for the specific engine involved. And be sure your customers know how important it is to change the oil regularly in these engines.
Be sure the pistons fit their bores correctly. The clearance between piston and bore is very close. If the piston will not be within limit, replace it. Also be sure that the piston ring grooves are within limits for the width, and that the new piston rings have the specified clearance in the grooves and the specified end gap. The crankshaft is the next item where critical measurements have to be made, since it handles all kinds of loads and stresses and must be fitted very closely with connecting rod bearings and main bearings. If there are scratches, grooves, or score marks in any of the bearing journals, they should be refinished for the next undersized bearing. Be sure that you measure each one of the journals as needed to check for the correct diameter, for taper within the specified limits, and for out of round within the specified limits. Most of these are measurements and checks you've done many times on other engines. They're just more critical on diesels because of high compression operation and more severe loading on the components.
Remember these important considerations. Keep everything clean. Pretend you're in an operating room. Follow the shop manual carefully and completely.
Make accurate measurements with accurate gauges. Use the proper special tools. Now let's take a brief quiz.
With the cylinder heads and valve systems on diesel engines, we observe the same rules as for other parts that are subjected to high compression and high stress. Proper procedure, cleanliness, and exactness of measurement. Besides this, diesel engine heads and valve systems have some unique operations. First, of course, most automotive diesels use indirect injection, so they are fitted with pre-combustion chambers into which the fuel is injected. Refer to your shop manual for procedures to remove and replace the pre-chambers, and also for instructions on how to inspect them. When the pre-chamber is put back in the head, there may be a retrusion dimension to check and maintain as specified in the shop manual. A very important procedure you must follow carefully is to remove the camshaft from an overhead cam cylinder head. What's the trick to that, Rick?
It's necessary to follow the correct shop manual procedure for loosening and removing the bearing caps to take valve spring pressure off the cam. If the proper sequence isn't followed, there may be results like this, a broken camshaft. Now the cylinder head must be inspected carefully and some precision measurements made. That's because on a diesel engine, the compression ratio is as high as 23:1, making precise valve operation much more important than on a gasoline engine, which has a ratio of about 8.5:1. But first, is the head warped? Use a straight edge to see if it's flat within the shop manual specifications. On most diesels, if the head is warped beyond specification, it cannot be reused. Milling or grinding the mating surface to straighten it out will change the compression ratio, so don't try it. The valve stem clearance is very close in diesel engines. It must be measured with a dial indicator. If it's too much, install a new valve or guide. Also, measure the runout of each valve seat and the width of each valve seat to help decide if the seats must be refinished. If you're doing a valve job, remember that some diesel valves can be ground, but others, because of special hardening, cannot. See the shop manual for valve resurfacing instructions.
Also, Rick, be sure to machine the seats exactly as instructed in the manual and to exact dimensions. Check the valve and seat for proper contact at the center of the valve face. Rick, is there any information you'd like to add on valves?
Yes. In some cases, you may have to measure valve retrusion, which is the depth of the valve below the face of the cylinder head, using a dial indicator for extreme accuracy. This is very important as compression ignition on a diesel requires very small clearance between the valve and piston. If this is not correct, shim or replace the valve according to the manual instructions.
All right. And that brings us to the overhead camshaft, which also has some very precise measurements that must be made to see if it can be reused. Are the cam lobes undamaged? Some very light pitting can be removed with an oil stone. Measure the height of each lobe and replace the camshaft if any is below specifications. Measure every bearing journal diameter, which must not be below specifications because of the severe cam loads. And measure the runout of the cam with a dial indicator at the center bearing journal. Now, if the cam passes inspection, it is necessary to measure the bearing journal oil clearance with Plastigauge. How does that work, Rick?
Well, Mr. Diesel, Plastigauge is a thin, round gauging material that flattens between a shaft journal and bearing surface when the bearing caps are tightened. The width of the flattened material accurately measures the oil clearance. Here's how to use it on a cam bearing journal. With the cam and all the bearing caps properly installed, remove one cap at a time and put a piece of Plastigauge on the top of the journal like this. Install the cap and tighten it to the specified torque. Remove the cap and use the Plastigauge envelope scale to measure how wide it flattened. That is the oil clearance. If it's okay, repeat the process for the other bearings one at a time.
The oil clearance must be as specified for all bearing journals after you have measured the journal diameters and found them correct. If the clearance is too much, you must replace the cylinder head and bearing caps, since there are no separate bearing inserts. We have explained that the diesel cylinder head and valve train service is very like on gasoline engines, but that it is more critical due to the high compression operation. Remember these points for special service attention. Use the shop manual procedures always. Service the pre-chambers and injection nozzles correctly. Use the correct loosening and tightening sequence for overhead cams to avoid damage from valve spring loads. Check the cylinder head flatness. Make precise valve measurements. Make precise camshaft and oil clearance measurements. And now, it's time for you to take a brief quiz. As we proceed with the assembly of the diesel engine, we wish to point out these most important general rules. First, remember your most important tools. The shop manual. Follow the procedures carefully. The torque wrenches. Every nut and bolt on a diesel engine must be tightened to specifications with wrenches you know are accurate. Be sure to control the cleanliness of the work area to keep all parts and tools clean.
And if you have to leave a job overnight, cover it up to prevent contamination.
Also, use new parts when you're so instructed by the shop manual. There are several bolts in certain diesels, some head bolts and some flywheel mounting bolts, for instance, that the manufacturer recommends should not be used because of the possibility of stretching or metal fatigue.
And remember that as you rebuild and check the engine, you'll be working around piston spray jets. Don't let them get bent or otherwise misaligned.
Now, it is most important to accurately check the clearance of the crankshaft main bearings after the shaft is installed, because the diesel main bearings must handle very high forces and torque. This must be done with Plastigauge. Also, on some diesels, it is necessary to fit bearings to each journal separately. Check the shop manual for the correct procedure for the engine you're overhauling. After you have fitted all the bearings, perform the crankshaft end play check as the manual instructs. If it is not to specifications, replace the selective thrust bearing. When you install the pistons and connecting rods, cover the rod bolts to protect the oil spray jets and the crankshaft journals. Oh, and remember, on some engines, it is necessary to use piston installation guides. Do not fail to use them. The clearance of the connecting rod bearings to the crankshaft journals is just as critical as the main bearings. Use the same procedure and check each one accurately. And after the rod bearings are checked and installed, be sure to check with a feeler gauge that the rods have proper side clearance between them.
Now that we've gotten the short block together, let's go on to the head. The cylinder head gasket is extremely important because it must seal in the tremendous pressures produced inside the engine. Careful installation and alignment of the gasket is essential to a proper rebuild. Normally, the gasket comes in only one thickness, but some diesels do have selective head gaskets so as to keep the compression ratio constant with variations in deck height and piston stroke. Be sure to follow the shop manual procedures to select the correct gasket.
Also, you must remember that the cylinder head cannot be installed on an overhead cam engine until the camshaft is timed to the crankshaft.
And once the cylinder head is bolted to the block, neither shaft can be rotated until the timing belt is installed, or damage to the pistons and valves will occur. To time the shafts, first turn the crankshaft and use a dial indicator to determine exactly when piston number 1 reaches and crosses top dead center. Then, turn the camshaft until the number 1 intake and exhaust valves are both closed. The shafts are now timed and you can install the head.
Here it is very critical to tighten the head bolts correctly, and you must use the shop manual. Now some engines make use of the torque angle method of tightening the head bolts. Here the head bolts are tightened to an initial amount of torque and then are tightened to a particular torque angle. On some diesels, new head bolts must be used. Once the cylinder head is bolted down, the timing gears and belts can be installed. The installation of the parts that control camshaft and ejection pump are extremely important because of the close tolerances in a diesel engine. Even an error as slight as one tooth on a gear or belt can result in serious damage to the engine. So be sure that you follow the shop manual procedures.
After the timing parts are all in place, adjust the valve clearance according to the procedures in the shop manual. Adjustment procedures vary greatly between engines, so follow those recommended procedures closely.
Under final precaution, after you have completed the engine buildup, install the correct grade of engine oil. For diesel engines, use oil specified by the manufacturer, unless, of course, you wish the engine to wear out again quickly after all that work. And so I say to you, service technicians, depend on diesel engines to be built for long life and to go several 100,000 miles if they're properly maintained and properly rebuilt when normal wear has occurred.
And depend on your skills, your accurate tools, the approved procedures, and extra care to overhaul diesel engines properly for solid customer satisfaction.
Well, Rick, that's about it for overhauling diesel engines. Thank you so much for all your help.
Thank you, Mr. Diesel.